This is Whitley Strieber. We're beginning Dreamland differently from usual this week. We have a special report. Linda Howe has obtained an interview that is quite simply mind-bending about the famous Rendlesham Forest UFO incident of 1980, 4 nights near Bentwaters Air Force Base, where again and again various U.S. military personnel encountered and interacted with apparent aliens. This case has been thoroughly debunked by frantic skeptics and people working for the Air Force, but now it's blown wide open. Linda Howe, earthfiles.com. Don't miss that great website.
Thanks, Whitley. 3 years ago, in November of 2002, the British Ministry of Defense released for the first time officially 180 pages that have been kept from the public for 22 years. The file subject was the several UFO sightings at Rendlesham Forest near RAF Woodbridge Bentwaters at the end of December 1980. One of those declassified documents began, quote, "We are aware that on 27 and 29 December 1980, a number of personnel from RAF Woodbridge saw strange lights in the vicinity of the base in Rendlesham Forest. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, United States Air Force, the deputy base commander, submitted a report on these events which was passed to the Ministry of Defense," unquote. Christmas to New Year's week in December 1980 was a tense and confusing time for several dozen men at the joint United States and English Royal Air Force Base at Bentwaters near the southeastern coast of the British Isles. In the early morning hours, right after Christmas Day, around December 27th, odd lights were seen moving in the Rendlesham Forest. Various security and military personnel investigated, and more lights were reported on December 28th and December 29th. 2 weeks after that, on January 13th, 1981, Colonel Halt wrote a summary to the Rendlesham incident on official U.S. Department of Air Force letterhead to the Royal Air Force. His subject was unexplained lights. Here are brief excerpts from that one-page document officially released by the MOD in 2002. Quote, "Early in the morning of 27 December 1980 at approximately 0300, 2 U.S. Air Force security patrolmen saw unusual lights outside the back gate at RAF Woodbridge. The individuals reported seeing a strange glowing object in the forest. The object was described as being metallic in appearance and triangular in shape, approximately 2 to 3 meters or 10 feet across the base, and approximately 2 meters high or 6.5 feet. It illuminated the entire forest with a white light. The object itself had a pulsing red light on top and a bank of blue lights underneath. The object was hovering or was on legs. As the patrolman approached the object, it maneuvered through the trees and disappeared. At that time, the animals on a nearby farm went into a frenzy. The next day, 3 depressions 1.5 inches deep and 7 inches in diameter were found where the object had been sighted on the ground. And the following night of 29 December 1980, the area was checked for radiation. Beta-gamma readings of 0.1 millirentgens were recorded with peak readings in the 3 depressions and near the center of the triangle formed by the depressions. Now, that was Colonel Halt. Another memo by the British Ministry of Defense released on its letterhead with the date, names of the addressee, and signature blacked out stated, quote, "As you know, OSI has completed a report on the landing of a craft of unknown origin, crewed by several entities near RAF Bentwaters on the night of December 29 and 30, 1980. Interestingly, OSI reports that the entities were approximately 1.5 meters tall, wore what appeared to be nylon-coated pressure suits, but no helmets. Conditions on the night were misty, giving the appearance that the entities were hovering above ground level. Tape recordings were made on which the entities are heard to speak in an electronically synthesized version of English with a strong American accent. Similar transmissions have been intercepted irregularly by the National Security Agency since 1975. According to OSI, entities had claw-like hands with 3 digits and an opposable thumb, unquote. And then the MOD memo concluded that the UFO landing in Rendlesham Forest was not considered a defense issue because the craft was peacefully and deliberately landing in a series of visits to SAC bases in the United States and Europe. That's an amazing conclusion and written in their document, given that the American government denies the existence of extraterrestrials and ET technology. And what is not included in either the January 13th, 1981 dated Colonel Halt memo or the British MOD memo is a description of what happened on January 9th to 10th, 1981, only 5 days before Colonel Halt wrote his summary. Colonel Halt allegedly returned to the Rendlesham Forest with a group of officers and even family members to watch yet again remarkable moving lights in the sky. But Colonel Halt never wrote a memo about the night of January 9th, 1981. But with me today on Dreamland, I have eyewitness details about what happened that night and into the early morning hours of January 10th, 1981, according to a U.S. Air Force security man who was there. His name is Steve LaPlume. He was born in Leominster, Massachusetts on July 14th, 1962, and he had his 43rd birthday this month. Right from high school, he enlisted in the United States Air Force on July 10th, 1980. He first went to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas for technical training in its police academy, and then he was shipped out to RAF Bentwaters in mid-September of 1980, and he was still waiting for his secret clearance to come through so that he could officially join the base security. In the meantime, he was doing shift reliefs and remembers being in the day room after Christmas when some airmen came in off duty later than usual. Word spread that some of them had been chased by a UFO out in the Rendlesham Forest, and people started making jokes about little green men and spaceships. And then 2 weeks later, U.S. Airman Steve LaPlume was on patrol at the Bentwaters East Gate with another airman, Wendell Palmer.
We were talking about the forest and the UFOs, and we had mentioned, something, I believe Palmer brought it up first about that's where, the UFOs had chased these guys or something, and we weren't even clear on what happened. And we're talking over the hood of the cruiser, which is kind of on either side of the car talking. And behind him, I look up and I see, sometimes in the night you can see satellites tracing across the sky. And I saw what I thought was a satellite, but it was a little bit brighter. And then suddenly this thing wasn't tracing across the sky. It was going up and down in the sky from, I'm trying to think the elevations it would be. If we use degrees off the horizon, probably about from 15 degrees off the horizon up to about 35, 45 degrees off the horizon. It was gyrating up and down. So I said, hey, what the heck is that? Palmer turned around and looked, and we stared at it for a few minutes, and he said, I don't know. He said, I'll go check and see what's on radar. So I kept an eye on it. He got in the cruiser, and he went down to the radar tower over there at the flight line. He returned maybe 15 minutes later, if that, maybe 5 minutes later. It was a very short time. And then he said that the only thing that was up in the air was a couple of helicopters from the pararescue guys and a C-130. So we both figured that whatever was doing that couldn't have been either one of those vehicles. They weren't physically capable. And at that point, he said, do you want to call it in? He said, we have to call it in because they said if you've seen anything goofy over here. So I said, okay, fine. So he got on the radio, and instead of implementing himself, he said, hey, LaPlume just saw a UFO. And then all hell broke loose at that point.
Well, like what?
Well, immediately the security phone rang at the booth because Palmer had given him my location. It rang. It was a Lieutenant England. He talked to me. What did I see? I explained to him just what I explained to you what I saw. He said, okay, keep an eye on it. There'll be somebody out there. And it wasn't I don't even think it was 10, 15 minutes. There were cars and people. I mean, there was so much brass there. I mean, I just turned 18, and it was like my first assignment. I haven't even gotten cleared to go in to do my actual job. So I haven't had any on-the-job training other than just standing at a post checking ID. So I was pretty intimidated. And there was a deputy base commander. My commander came out. My commander was my shift commander, Lieutenant England. He came out. By deputy base commander, that would have been Colonel Halt. He'd come over from Bentwaters. I think he was driving like an MG Midget or something like that. He came over in a car. And then also there were some people that I didn't know that were from from Woodbridge. And they were all like captains and colonels and stuff like that. And one of them had brought his wife. And this is the part I can't get. And I don't understand why nobody focuses on this. It just totally bewilders me. This guy brought out his wife and his teenage kid, and they had a Nikon camera. And both the kid was kind of calm, but the wife was very much excited about the whole situation. Had her camera, was checking it. I was going, oh boy, I hope we get to see one this time. So somebody knew something was going on.
And when the brass showed up, including the wife with the camera, where exactly did they drive and stop their cars?
Well, we were at the security gate. They jumped in and they headed out the road off base. They got to the end of the road and they took a right. And after that, I have no idea where they went or stopped.
So they had to exit the base by going through the east gate?
Correct.
And the direction that they went
was towards the Rendlesham Forest.
And you're assuming that they knew that something was going to come there that they would photograph?
My assumption is they knew something was going on and they knew where to go because they jumped in a car and left. They didn't ask. They said where, and we pointed off in the direction that we last saw it, then jumped in the car and went. And I don't know where they went, and I believe Palmer and I even commented on that, was, where they going, where are they going to look for,
Right.
Because we weren't aware of anything landing in the woods or any of that.
And that was the night of January 9th, 1981.
Correct. Lieutenant England briefed me and said, hey, Colonel Halt's coming out, just so you know, don't be nervous. Tell him your post is all safe and secure. Let him know what you saw. And, oh, by the way, he just made Brigadier General today. They just passed him in Congress. So Colonel Williams came out, who is now General Williams. He came out. I did what I was told. They gave us a Starlight scope, and they all jumped into an Air Force. At the time, they had like these blue Air Force station wagons with yellow lettering on the side that said Air Force. They jumped in one of those, and they all took off towards the woods, which Palmer and I didn't understand because this thing was way high in elevation. It had gone over the direction of the woods, but it had never gone down anywhere close to the elevation of the trees or anything. So they all took off in that direction, and we were left standing there with a Starlight scope. So we just kind of fooled around with the Starlight scope, checked each other out through the Starlight scope, and goofed off, And then they came back about 45 minutes later. They posted me on that gate all night long, told me to report if I saw anything else, and they all left. And when they returned, they gave no indication that they saw anything.
Okay, now, so what you're doing is you're extending that the date of unusual aerial phenomena went on to at least January 9th, and that people came out with high rank who seemed to be excited about this light making this odd behavior in the sky.
Yeah, very much excited.
Okay, now, is there anything more that you had firsthand experience with that would tie all of this directly to extraterrestrial biological entities?
Okay. The second half of this story is, after everybody had left, Palmer had gone, and now he had to go give bathroom breaks and stuff like that. He came out maybe an hour or so later, okay, just to check on me, make sure everything was cool. So we sat there and we talked for a little bit, and again, we were just kind of like, it was kind of a cold night, so we were actually hanging on the hood of his car because it was kind of warm from the heat of the engine. And from over where the lighthouse is, then we saw light coming from that direction that was making basically a beeline towards us. It was coming in low and slow, and it was just moving along. And it was just lights at the time, but there was, I don't remember a white light, but I remember kind of a small, if I do it proportionately, there was a blue light, a green light, a red light, and I believe a yellow light. And the blue light seemed to be more prominent than any of the other lights. It wasn't as if there was a red light on the tail and a white light on the sides like you would associate with a regular aircraft.
So what happened?
Okay, so at the point where the vehicle, I'll call it because I don't know what it was probably at least 1,000 feet off the deck, off the ground. And it came over the trees. It came right up the access road next to the runway. It was, up in the sky. I remember it being very long and cylindrical. Everybody says like cigar shape, but it seemed to be more like that than it was round or anything.
Mm-hmm.
It came over our heads. I remember it being over our heads, looking underneath, and just being awestruck looking up at it and thinking, wow, this is the neatest thing I've ever seen in my life.
And
because it was a physical vehicle.
What were you seeing exactly in detail?
Well, I remember seeing the underside, which was dark and having shapes like squares and, something that had physical shapes. And I remember looking at that blue light, and then the next thing I know, this thing was to the right of us, and it was tracing off into the sky from where we originally saw it before we ever called anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it just got smaller and smaller up in the sky as it gradually got higher and higher, blended with the stars, and that's the last we saw of it.
So what happened between your looking up and seeing the square shapes on the bottom and then it being to the right?
I have no idea.
So you're suggesting that you guys might have missing time?
I honestly don't know. I sat and thought about that and I don't know whether I just blocked that few seconds out or whether something happened. I honestly can't remember what happened during that time.
Well, for a second, go back to it being over you. How close do you think it was above you?
Like I'm saying, probably 1,000 feet.
And is it
that? I mean, I remember seeing physical stuff underneath it, but it was a very large structure too.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at. If it were,
well, I know it's very hard. I don't have anything to judge it against because it was just against the sky. It was big, and I didn't have anything to really size it up.
If you were extending your arm right now and pointing your index finger out,
okay,
would this object have been bigger than your index finger in the sky above you, even if it was 1,000 feet above you?
Oh, this thing was, if I put my arms both to the sides of me, it was that big looking up at it. Does that make sense?
Okay, so if this was 1,000 feet above you, using your guess, you're saying that you would have to expand your arms.
I think this thing was like a couple football fields long. That's how big this thing was.
Okay. And cylindrical, could you see only the bottom or could you see an end?
No, all I could see was the underneath side, and that's the part that really kind of goosed me up. Is I remember it coming towards us, seeing lights, but I couldn't see a real good shape until it was very close to us and almost over us. And I remember just seeing that it was cylindrical, and the part I was looking at was like the front half. It wasn't the whole thing. It was like the rest of it was in the dark, and the part I was looking at was lit up. And it wasn't very bright, shiny light. It was just a real pale, dull, pastel-type lights.
Why did you have the impression of cylindrical?
Just the shape of it. It was long and cylindrical. I mean, it wasn't wide. It was longer than it was wide.
And could you see, even though there was darkness and shadow fell off, could you see some way the impression of the entire cylindrical object above you being so large that you'd have to expand your arms above you to make the distance that you were seeing in the sky above you?
To the right would have been the front of it, and I could see that there was a difference between the vehicle and the sky behind it. And to the back was just very long, so I'm just estimating that.
Mm-hmm. Now, and was Palmer with you?
Yeah, Palmer was with me, yes.
What did the two of you say to each other?
Oh, absolutely nothing. We both looked straight up at that thing, and we never said a word to each other.
That seems strange.
I was completely awestruck looking at this thing. Kind of looking up, just going, whoa, And there wasn't one word exchange until after it was off, heading up into the sky. And either he or I might have said something to the effect of, well, look at it disappearing, you can hardly tell it from a star now or something. Mm-hmm. And we made mention of the fact that it was unrecognizable at one point.
And Palmer does not have any memory of what happened with this huge thing above you either?
I don't know. It was very strange that the moments following that, we looked at each other and he said, do you want to call this in? And I looked at him and said, hell no. And he said, okay, me either. And we honestly never talked about that after that ever since. We didn't say one word to each other about it. I never asked him what he saw. He never asked me what I saw. There was absolutely nothing said between us.
And you didn't want to report it? Why?
Well, we just didn't want to report that part because we just thought, forget it. They're going to think we're total freaks, I don't know. Maybe it's just fright. Mm-hmm. The ridicule everybody else got.
Mm-hmm. And you were 18.
Correct, yeah. I just turned 18 in July. And when I got back, my debriefing was my sergeant came up to me and said, "What'd you see?" I told him, and I didn't tell him about the second half. I just told him about the first half, that we agreed upon. And then he said, okay. He said, well, you missed the bus. You have to find your own way back to the barracks. I ended up having to hitchhike back to the barracks because I was late. So.
And nobody else ever debriefed you on anything?
No, nothing. Absolutely nothing.
And you never heard anything about the brass who were out there who seemed to be excited and had cameras?
Never heard anything of them at all, no.
And in terms of the cylinder object, the huge one, did anybody else in the Bentwaters, Rendlesham Forest, any of the security,
nobody else that saw it, which is so strange.
Meaning that you and Palmer are the only two that you know?
That I know of that saw it.
And both of you chose not to tell anyone?
Correct.
When it comes to Larry Warren's story about the underground facility,
the only thing I heard was from Larry Warren. He came into my dorm room after my incident because he had heard I had an incident, and he closed the door, we locked it, and we sat and talked, and he said, I want to tell you what happened to me because I know something happened to you, and we're kind of in the same boat. And he seemed very, I don't want to say frightened, but very concerned about his safety. And he told me about the first night he saw something, which, when he described it to me, he was walking back to base with someone else, and he saw something in the sky. He told me about the lights exploding apart, coming back together to form one ship or something to that effect. I'm honestly, I can't give good details recall. But then he said that somebody with a badge came up to him, and I believe he said it was the OSI, the Air Force OSI, and had told him, or debriefed him and told him they didn't see nothing. The next thing I know, he said there was another night where they were trying to get the light oils going, nothing was working, they had trouble getting the fuel pumps to work to get the gas in light oils, the trucks weren't working right, that they had lit up the area. He told me pretty much the same story that he's been telling for 20-some-odd years, that Gordon Williams was there. He said something about somebody falling in the mud, and I don't know if it was Williams or somebody, but that everybody was around this craft. Some were closer than others. Some of them were crying. Some of them were just standing there, and that and he told me that it was a colonel who'd gone up and talked to these beings, and that they weren't talking using voice, that they were communicating some other way. And he described the beings. He said that they were floating outside the craft, and they looked like kids in snowsuits, was his direct quote. He said that's all his mind could even think of it, so they were kids in snowsuits.
Steve LaPlume is now a businessman in China, and he said that he contacted me recently to tell this part of the story in detail now because he has always wondered why Colonel Holt, other brass, and even the wife and child with cameras were so excited the evening of January 9th, 1981, but in all of the TV and media done about the Bentwaters incident since, no one ever focused on these dates. If anyone listening has any more information about what happened on January 9th to 10th, 1981, in the Rendlesham Forest at the Woodbridge Bentwaters Air Force Base, please contact me at earthfiles@earthfiles.com. It is really a comment, Whitley, on this phenomena that keeps going on decade after decade, that 22 years after an event, one of the people there who had a completely different experience is now coming forward because until now, he really wasn't comfortable in going into all this detail.
And I think of all of the government shills / skeptics who have worked on this and probably been paid very handsomely for the lying that they've done about this case. If only he had been around 10, 20 years ago, what has happened now with this and other cases like it, they've simply been dismissed. They've disappeared from the public mind and public imagination. And whoever's out there, and whatever they may be doing, they remain completely free to do it while being ignored by those of us, that is to say, the human species, who are their victims, their children, their prey. I mean, who knows what we are.
And yet, the brass were excited. And if the MOD memo is any insight, at least on this particular event in the world's history, with an association with extraterrestrial biological entities, using the government's own phrase, it means that they were concluding that this was a peaceful mission by extraterrestrials, remember it said, making visits to SAC bases in the United States and Europe, almost as if this was something prearranged. And what a huge disconnect from the so-called official policy of denial that our government certainly has had for the entire 20th and 21st century so far.
Well, Linda, thank you very much for blowing my mind, and I think everybody else's mind, with a truly extraordinary, amazing story. Frantic skeptics and people working for the Air Force, but now it's blown wide open. Linda Howe, earthfiles.com. Don't miss that great website.
Thanks, Whitley. 3 years ago, in November of 2002, the British Ministry of Defence released for the first time officially 180 pages that have been kept from the public for 22 years. The file subject was the several UFO sightings at Rendlesham Forest near RAF Woodbridge Bentwaters at the end of December 1980. One of those declassified documents began, quote, "We are aware that on 27 and 29 December 1980, a number of personnel from RAF Woodbridge saw strange lights in the vicinity of the base in Rendlesham Forest. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, United States Air Force, the deputy base commander, submitted a report on these events, which was passed to the Ministry of Defense," unquote. Christmas to New Year's week in December 1980 was a tense and confusing time for several dozen men at the joint United States and English Royal Air Force Base at Bentwaters near the southeastern coast of the British Isles. In the early morning hours, right after Christmas Day, around December 27th, odd lights were seen moving in the Rendlesham Forest. Various security and military personnel investigated, and more lights were reported on December 28th and December 29th. 2 weeks.
This is Whitley Strieber. We're beginning Dreamland differently from usual this week. We have a special report. Linda Howe has obtained an interview that is quite simply mind-bending about the famous Rendlesham Forest UFO incident of 1980, 4 nights near Bentwaters Air Force Base, where again and again various U.S. military personnel encountered and interacted with apparent aliens. This case has been thoroughly debunked by...
After that, on January 13th, 1981, Colonel Halt wrote a summary to the Rendlesham incident on official U.S. Department of Air Force letterhead to the Royal Air Force. His subject was unexplained lights. Here are brief excerpts from that one-page document officially released by the MOD in 2002. Quote, "Early in the morning of 27 December 1980 at approximately 0300, 2 U.S. Air Force